Good evening, friends. This is Russell Cordell Staker, and you are back at These Small Hours podcast. Tonight's essay is entitled English Major by Russell Cordell Staker. I transferred to Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah after 2 years abroad. Halfway through my sophomore year, I was failing college and dead broke. I was as low as I had ever been. The varnish with its lustrous shine was off the Y. I was taking a cold, discerning look at the school and its benefactor, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was clearly difficult to ignore the level of bullshit I was standing in, but I was quietly inclined indefinitely to continue shoveling anyway, which I did with a certain degree of humility and terrible guilt. Mormonism, steeped in its miasma of pretentious mythology and structured elitism, felt increasingly hollow and overly burdensome. Inside the seal of a sanctified bubble of self-confidence was an all-or-nothing adherence to building God's kingdom, a phalanx corporate matrix of rules and weird doctrine and obsessive record-keeping of ritualistic ordinances. The condition of individual value in the faith is predicated on worthiness, a most foul word to my mind and completely weaponized as spiritual abuse. My willful curiosity and intellectual acuity fueled a firestorm of doubt and disdain for a covenant I was born into, but one I never would have made had the church shown all its cards. It was difficult to resolve the attraction and repulsion I felt in the faith. Like facing a woman with perfect tits and shit breath, it was a stifling mindfuck. A complex body of unsubstantiated spiritual assertions and lingering historical prejudices and sexual malfeasance. The chasm would only widen the more I read and the older I got. I began to openly acknowledge how impossible it would be, no matter how hard I tried, to ignore what was evident before me. This eternal relationship was not going to work out. I felt a heaviness I had never known, but I managed the burden by aptly sustaining a temporized cognitive dissonance. The threat of my growing spiritual existentialism was something I knew would require heavy reinforcement and perspective, which I was not then prepared to fully summon. I needed more experience, more depth perception, more language, more of life. I certainly could not have articulated much of this to the extent I can now, but the perception of prescience was strongly there nonetheless, and I recognized it. If there was a singular grace in all of this, it was my natural proclivity for reading deep literature across a broad spectrum, which served as blocker and tackler to the syrupy culture and niched indoctrination of a surface belief system. In essence, my intellectualism was the proton pump inhibitor to the induced stomach acid derived from the often mind-numbing study of the standard works and general authority pronouncements of the church. If I were only required to read the Bible, I may never have questioned any of it, but the Book of Mormon, poorly written as it was, cheapened the Jesus I admired in the New Testament. Additionally, the Doctrine and Covenants read like a trail of postscripts and apologies from a polyandrous Joseph Smith just covering his tracks on his way to catching a bullet he may well have deserved. I would later find out that the Pearl of Great Price was an outright fraud, which further implicates the odd account of Smith's stone and hat translation of the gold plates. I had the wizard's curtain in my hands and I was ready to pull it back. For the first time in my life, I was testing a searing counterbalance of contradiction. Much of this was subconscious, but I was making a choice to challenge the incongruity that was there. It was liberating and refreshing. At the same moment, I was experiencing my first bout of depression. The campus at BYU during my undergraduate tenure, 1995 through 1997, was a chain-link nightmare. It did not sync with the day of the feast, royal blue grapes I'd kept in distorted memory of homecoming 1985 and bottled into a dreamy fermented elixir. In some ways, that day felt like an old VHS recording I'd watched over and over again in my mind. My dad, BA Communications, 1975, brought me to see Robbie Bosco surgically castrate the San Diego State Aztecs, 28-0. It was the day after I'd wept it was the year after I'd wept joyfully as the Cougs beat Michigan for the national championship in the Holiday Bowl. Dad took me to the Wilkinson Center before the game for the most sumptuous breakfast I'd ever tasted, and after to the bookstore where I got a poster of linebacker Leon White sitting on a Mack truck, which I later hung above my bed next to Jim McMahon in Chicago Bear blue and Danny Ainge in Boston Celtic green. We strolled across the campus together, Dad pointing out places he'd gotten into the sort of trouble aspirant of every college freshman. I was too young to understand the energy I was feeling, but I loved it. Dad was so handsome and animated that day, a man in his prime, showcasing a place where life truly began for him. I made note of everything, particularly the pretty girls in tight royal blue and white t-shirts. Oh, how they bounced. I set my sights for arrival after I had grown a foot or two. And then suddenly, I pressed the forward button on the VCR to advance the tape, and there I was, 10 years later, failing as an accounting major on Accutane. The girls were still there, but they weren't smiling at me, and some marketing douche had convinced the school to orphan the iconic royal blue and white color scheme for dark navy, tan, and black. WTF? One night after a bleak accounting class in the Tanner building, I wandered the campus distraught and alone. I went to get some cash in an ATM machine outside of the Wilkinson Center. All I got was a receipt informing me I had insufficient funds. I was staring at a big goddamn hole in the ground where renovations for the Harold Bealey Library had begun, and remember thinking that even if the angel Moroni appeared to me at that miserable moment and called me to righteousness, I would have told him to fuck off. I knew I was unexceptional, and I was okay with that. I was enraged and disappointed, mostly with myself. I no longer cared about God's plan of salvation, and I wondered if I ever had. I just wanted a different taste in my mouth. For a fleeting moment, I considered packing it all up and heading to Fort Collins to chase Catholic girls at Colorado State. Instead, I already knew what I was going to do. I walked off campus and bought my first pack of Marlboro Reds and then drove my piece of shit car to an empty baseball diamond and sat alone at the center of the bleachers to smoke and read Winner Take Nothing by Ernest Hemingway. The very next morning, I entered the Jesse Knight Humanities Building, JKHB, and declared myself an English major. Literature by nature is subversive, rebellious, sexual, sensual, intimate, argumentative, challenging, plain, fucking honest. Hard to discuss with insecure people, non-religious, agnostic, humorous to the point of irreverent buck-snorting laughter, mighty, pornographic, depressing, addictive, sad beyond belief, torturous, laborious, and long-winded, sufferable, sensational, kind, curious, full of empathy, all heart, complete nonsense, imagined and real, fiction and nonfiction, grammatically correct and free-forming, history and memoir and essay and poem, and short story and novella and novel, a view of paradise and all of hell, discordant and impetuous, presumptive, assumptive, maddening and insecure, eloquent, elegant, silly and petty, short and long and in between, serious and frivolous, poetry and prose, boisterous, harsh, male and female, driven by penis and manipulated by vagina, defecatory, masturbatory, unrequited love, consummate and consummated, forceful, thoughtful, disrespectful and mocking, insightful, equable, non-discriminatory and prejudiced, faithless and atheist, Christian and Muslim and Jewish and humanist and blasphemous, full of rumor, and speculation and ideology and philosophy, skeptical, measured and unfettered, passionate, lustful, circumspect, in full possession of the entire spectral thrust of life, and living and dying and death, and sickness and health, and worry and doubt and anger, and conflict and resolution, resurrection and rebirth, cynical, satiric, intolerant, sober and drunk, ebullient, murderous, vast and miraculous, sublime, and usually far more enjoyable and informative than Scripture. I pulled Ernest Hemingway's Winner Take Nothing from my shelf last week and held it in my lap for a long time. Didn't even open it. Just looked long and hard at the image on its black and anemic yellow dust jacket. I know the book well. It has been a good traveler with me. The stories inside are plain, hard as life, written in sentences that land like gut punches. The stark setting on the cover pulls me in, and I'm there with it, standing near a wooden porch, looking outward beyond a 2-log cow fence over a field of tall grass under the hot high noon sun, as an old Hudson kicks up a cloud of dust from a road unseen. 2 birds, probably hawks hunting field mice, hover open-winged in the sky where sailing clouds hang like boats on a solar-drenched sea out to a line of meandering foothills along the horizon. There is nothing remarkable in the image, but it is the sense of movement that reminds me that this hour has already passed, that what there is can never be again. I pulled it up and looked closer. I remained with it for a moment, just sitting in the chair with the weight of the book in my hands. It was clear to me that the image has nothing to do with what it shows and everything to do with what it can't. After a while, I opened the book and turned to a clean, well-lighted place and began to read. I've thought long and hard over the last several weeks about BYU. I don't know why. I don't really remember much about it. There are those who I knew and who knew me while we were there together that may well have no idea what I was really experiencing, and their interpretation of my time in Provo would be valid. But it is only a sliver of a moving video image of a younger man coming to terms with the contradiction of his own willful viewpoint. I was not happy at Brigham Young. If I were to describe my time there, I would say it bordered on banal misery. As a boy, I had put so much emphasis on the mythology of the school and its front porch to eternity that I was, in hindsight, guaranteed to be terribly disappointed. I hesitate to allow for the previous sentence, if only because it may sound as if I had unrealistic expectations. In truth, I really didn't. In fact, I had none at all. I knew by the time I arrived that I was indeed unexceptional, and that the emphasis of my presumption for BYU, which I had harbored since I was a boy with posters of glory on his walls, was entirely my own creation. I was not angry at the school, and I did not find anyone else there loathsome or harboring ill motives towards me. For the most part, it was and shall always remain a clean, well-lighted place. Its indoctrinated religious foundation was quaint, even at its most malignant, and never interfered with the natural glide path I chose as an English major to see myself as quickly through it all as possible. From the moment I got there, I had only one intent: to get the hell out as quickly as I could and get on with life. There is no one to blame and no fault to be given. It was just a place I hustled through, and aside from 2 or 3 girls I really deeply thought I loved, and wished that I'd been more confident in letting them know that, I got exactly what I wanted while I was there and prepared my literary lens for a very long shot in life. I graduated from the School of Humanities with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English literature and a minor in Dutch and Flemish in December 1997. My cumulative GPA was 2.86. I didn't attend the ceremony, I just had the school mail my diploma. What I'm most proud of is my durability. I had so terribly tanked my pristine GPA from freshman year after returning from 2 years in Europe that the solid grades I received once I put myself in my true milieu as a literature major only marginally redeemed the damage done. There would be no academic options for me after BYU, and I knew it. I did later receive a master's degree from Ball State University, of which I am immensely proud. But I know deep in my heart the vast talent and potential I had while at BYU that was never able to find its place and flourish. Nobody gave a damn. That is entirely on me and no one else. I hold no blame for the school, its silly church, or any of my professors. I was a poor kid who had no connections. My truest friends were the books I read in the lonely corners of the library basement of the HBLL and the 5 dudes I lived with in a little blue house off campus at 694 North, 100 West, as well as every girl I worked alongside as a waiter at Maggleby's. I loved every one of them with all of my heart. I was always earnest and kind in what I attempted, and largely kept to myself and the papers I poorly wrote. I had no sense for what would come after BYU other than a confidence of self, reminding me of my ability to figure it out as I went along. I did what most English majors with poor grades do after college. I got into sales to make money for the Harvard MBAs sitting behind their self-important and largely undeserved corporate senior vice president desks, while I kept getting laid off and moved out. Those important people of pedigree can keep the change. If there is a heaven after this life, I will play second base for the Dodgers in the springs and summers of my forever existence. And in the off seasons, I will earn a PhD in English literature from the University of Chicago, where Norman Maclean once taught. Only now he will be alive, and I will ask him with great respect to be my advisor. Upon receiving that much wished-for doctorate, which I will never be invited to get in this life, I will be offered a position to teach literature to innumerable souls who have lost their way, and I will reignite the human fire so deeply embedded inside all of us, but which for them has sadly been extinguished. I'm already working on that curriculum. Its reading list is profound. There is but one more wish in the cornfield for me, that when this life is over, I may continue unobstructed to be a writer, only just. Maybe God himself will read one of my books. After all else, I'm only just passing through. Aren't we all? I am an English major. RCS, 19 July, 2020. That, my friends, is the essay for tonight, and I hope you won't mind, but I'm going to take a quick sip of water from my big metallic bottle here. And no, that's not whiskey. It was water. It's a pleasure to be here, and I have several things I want to share in conjunction with the essay I've just written. First and foremost, I want to express that writing this essay took some time. I've been really focused on my novel, but I really struggled with this one because I was getting into some territory that I know will be easily offensive to people that may know me closely, certainly from my former life as a Mormon, and also in regards to some of the truth that I'm coming to with this. But I remind myself daily that the life of a writer also requires an ability to part company with courteous individuals now and then, and I have to be able to express myself in a way that allows me to continue to progress. More than anything, the message of this essay is quite progressive and helpful and kind. I think, if anything, I've come to a greater peace in the years since those days at BYU. And while there was a great deal of joy, and I have some very wonderful memories of my time as a student and as an English major at Brigham Young, it's exactly as I was able to put it down in this essay. Much of what we find in life, and I'm sure anyone listening would agree, is distortion. So what we experience as we're going through it is in part mythology, as well as the present moment, and the wishful ideals of the future state in which we're headed. And naturally, at that time, for me, BYU was all of the above, as it is for anybody in college. College is an interesting period of time. And individuals in college are still figuring themselves out, as I certainly was. I want to start in reference to where I began in the essay, which talked about the low point, which for me was the fall of 1995. At that point, I had returned the prior summer from a 2-year sojourn as an emissary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to at the time, it was the Belgium Antwerp mission. And then that mission merged with the Netherlands Amsterdam mission. And when I got home, I was fluent in Dutch and in Flemish, and well wise to a lot of things that I was putting together. I, as a boy, had always been and have always been throughout my life a very deep, omnivorous reader. And I, prior to my mission, had read the Bible front to back 3 times, the Book of Mormon probably 4 or 5 times, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, a lot of Mormon literature quite extensively. And I often said to myself, and still say to this day, that I left a Mormon and I came back Catholic and Protestant. My grandfather Staker, at the airport before I flew to Belgium, flew to Brussels on September 21st, 1993. It was the last day that I saw him. He passed away in April of 1995. And I did talk to him briefly on the phone from Belgium. He was incapacitated after suffering a series of strokes. But I remember embracing my grandfather, and we wept in each other's arms. And I loved my grandpa Staker. His first name was Alden. He was a master mechanic for Smith's Chevrolet in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and he could build all kinds of things with his hands. He was a hard-working, dogged individual who just never quit. And he was married to a wonderful, beautiful woman, my grandma Staker, who was extremely vertical in the Mormon faith. And I think in some respects, my grandpa Staker, he'd hitched his wagon and he went along for that ride. And I was always proud of my grandpa Staker. When I was a freshman at Ricks College, I got to know him as a man, and that was very helpful for me because we had some conversations. But I digress. The point I wanted to make is that when I said goodbye to him, prior to getting on that big jet for Belgium, I knew I wasn't going to see him again. And he told me at that time, he said, the mission is the best kept secret of the church. And to this day, I'm not sure I know what his meaning for that was, but I certainly know what it is for me. And I agree with Grandpa. It was, and it is, the best kept secret of the church, because by the time I'd gone through that, and I'd served in a land of very pacifistic individuals that looked at religion as just kind of a kooky thing, which it really actually is. And the Mormon faith, and I'm trying to be really kind in saying this, is just a cult. It really is. I know that's going to be hard for some people to hear, but it's locked in its own miasmic way of thinking. And the biggest problem with Mormonism for me is its elitist perspective. And that's probably the singular thing that after my mission, when I got back to BYU, it was a fetid stink. Because I was unexceptional and I didn't have any grand expectation of BYU. I was there to get a degree and have some fun, of course. Everybody in college does. I was interested in girls. I had ambitions, but I didn't have any money. I didn't have any connections. And the church that I had put so much energy and emphasis into, because I was always so earnest and just devout in what I did. I lived a good, clean life. Sure, I smoked cigarettes. I drank some beer. I probably felt up a couple of girlfriends here and there, but by and large, I was a good, honorable guy, and I treated everybody with kindness. I treated women, I still do, with kindness. I was very forthright in my perspective. I tried to be deferential, even in my blind spots. For people of all different backgrounds, I really try to put myself in their shoes, as Atticus Finch often told Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird. So my DNA, just the nature of who I was clean. It was good. And I don't give any credit to the church for that. It's just that I was built to be like a superstar in Mormondom. But by the time I got home from a mission, the varnish was off, and I knew that relationship inevitably was not going to work out. It took me 20 years officially to completely leave the church. In 2017, I had my name legally and officially removed from its records, although they're probably still counting me. But it was a hard thing, and I knew in the fall of 1995 that it was pretty much over. But this is where durability comes in, and something that I wrote pretty detailed in the essay is the fact that I had an ability to not be destructive in that moment, but to be quite constructive, and I made a really great choice. I was suffering going through a major that I thought was going to provide, adequate living and whatever, and I realized, I was like, what are you doing, dude? You're not an accountant. I mean, numbers and I don't agree very well. I'm a language guy. I love story. I love drama. I love the idea of the progression from static to dynamic. And I'd been reading William Shakespeare at the age of 12. I was a consummate reader of all of Louis L'Amour's great Western tales. I read The Lord of the Rings like most kids, I guess I did, but I read it over and over again. And so many other books that stand out. Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. I had a sense of adventure, and I realized that I was on a swashbuckling ride through a very puritanical, simplistic, and overly elitist environment. And I thought the only way I'm going to make it through is I've got to get on my own pirate ship. And the most subversive, rebellious thing I could do was be an English major. And the crossover is that BYU doesn't get credit for my being an English major, because that was a choice I was already going to make for myself. I'm just glad I did at that moment when I was holding that receipt that said insufficient funds, because I was so frustrated and so over some of the just BS that I thought, this is just not going to work. So I jumped on my own pirate ship, and I'm an English major for life. That doesn't change. And I think I knew then, without knowing as well as I know now, that I was already well on my way to who I was going to be. I remember one particular morning, I was walking across campus, and I ran into a girl that I knew from my church back home in Colorado. She was a couple years younger than I was, and she was beautiful, just absolutely stunning. And I saw her getting out of a brand new cream-colored Saab that she was driving. And I drove like a Buick. I don't know what it was. My dad got me one car. It was a Buick something or other, a complete piece of shit. That car broke down. And then I got the car I drove in high school. He brought that back over, and it was a 1976 Chrysler Cordoba, a big old boat, blue. And, I was so frustrated. I just had junk cars, no money. And, I was a 21-year-old guy. I wasn't drinking beer. I should have, but I wasn't. I was keeping the honor code at BYU. And I see this girl, and I ached inside. She was so lovely. And I thought, man, I would give anything just to spend a day with her. just to hold her hand. I mean, I just had such basic needs, I guess, at that point. But I remember the look of pity that she had on her face. And I don't mean that in any way disrespectful of her. She was kind to me, and I'm not going to mention her name, but she was very wealthy too. She came from a very, very wealthy family. And I knew I was never going to have a shot with her. And yet she slowed down, and she talked to me for a few minutes. And as she walked away, I thought, Russell, you're a nobody, dude. I mean, girls aren't checking you out. And I just didn't have anything to offer. So I thought the only way I'm going to survive this is I got to get on the path that I'm made to be on. And that's when I made the choice to study English. I want to talk briefly a little bit about some of the culture of BYU before I round this out to really what this is about, because this is not a negative expression of Mormonism, even though I've said some really hard and true things. And it's not a negative thing about my experience with BYU. I'm grateful for both, quite frankly. They provided part of the contradictory perspective and grounding that I've needed that has propelled me forward. I look at both of them as I would a dead skin. They served a purpose for a period of time in my life, and then I shed both of them, and I'm far better off without them now, but I will always be deferential to the experience of that time. One of the things that was very asinine to me that really grated, that was very hard for me, is that I'd served a very, very good mission. I worked really hard in the Netherlands and Belgium, and it was in a country that just didn't care about Mormonism, and they shouldn't. It's a very Mormonic religion. It doesn't have a lot to offer, and it asks people to live a life that's just not, quite frankly, true to who they are, especially in Europe. Very puritanical, elitist, and the mythology around Joseph Smith alone is just, it can be very, very grating. And as a literary guy, my own reading of the Book of Mormon was just a buzzkill. You know, I really, to this day, I love the Bible. In fact, I'm reading the Old Testament again right now. I'm reading Eugene Peterson's The Message, which is just marvelous because he's translated into modern language. And it's fitting because 2020 is such a clusterfuck right now. I'm sorry, I'm saying some bad words tonight, but it's very Old Testament biblical, and so to reread that it's been amazing. So anyway, I'm getting back to the point that I was very well versed in Scripture, and it was offensive to me every time I read the Book of Mormon the older I got, because it's so poorly put together, so poorly written. A lot of the stories in there are so bizarre, and they add really no value to what I was reading about particularly in the New Testament. The Savior in the New Testament to me he's the Savior. The Book of Mormon just felt like a cheap knockoff. It was like a sequel version of something that just didn't offer anything new. And then much of Mormonism is not derived from the Book of Mormon. It's derived from these soliloquies in the Doctrine and Covenants and from a faulty document that was a fraud, which is the Pearl of Great Price. And then on top of that, they put a lot of pronouncement in their general authorship. And so it's mental gymnastics on top of mental gymnastics, to the point where it's just too much. And part of the curriculum at BYU that to me is very asinine, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say some hard things here, is that they require religious courses. Now, on the surface, it makes sense. It's a private school. It's owned and embodied by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I have no problem with them saying or dictating, hey, you've got to take religious courses. But if you're not studying theology, you shouldn't be graded for that. And furthermore, many of the professors in the religion department, to me, were just clowns. I had a class in the fall of 1995. I'm thankful I do not remember the name of that woman or the gentleman I'm about to talk about very briefly, but I took a New Testament course, and I remember one conversation in a class in the afternoon, and the entire lecture was about the color of some dude's robe following the disciple. And I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. This is what we're talking about. And it was just a detraction from the greater story of the day of the feast at Matthew's feast, and the woman that just wanted to put her hand on the hem of the Savior's garment. And she was getting off on some other thing that had nothing to do with anything. I just thought, this is ridiculous, and I'm going to get a grade for this, which is just further aggravating because I was failing out of accounting at the time. And then the following semester, I took a Book of Mormon course with just a really sanctimonious douchebag. The guy was a gas bag. I'm sorry. Again, hard words, but I'm just going to say it. And again, I was 21 going on 22. So, I was high, wide, and handsome a little bit. So I take ownership of this. But the assignment was, I was supposed to write a paper about my testimony of the Savior. And I put my heart into it. I'm not saying it was written, maybe it wasn't written very articulately. I don't know. I'm sure it was. I was a solid enough writer then. I'm sure I did just fine. But I do remember putting a lot of heart into it, and I expressed some very deep felt expression about the Savior. And I got a C+ on the paper, and in the margin, he questioned, and he used the word veracity of my testimony. And I thought, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to grab this dude by the nutsack and let him know who's who. I just thought, this is ridiculous. And those kinds of things graded on top of the syrupy culture that I was observing. BYU from the outset, when I got there, was not the thing that I had imagined as a kid. And again, I didn't have any expectation because and I do mean this, I saw myself as unexceptional. I wasn't walking across campus with a sense of entitlement. I didn't think that I deserved anything. I knew I had to work my butt off. And I was there to get an education, but I expected so much more of a church that I had given so much of my attention and energy and resources. and devotion. And I just felt like I was I hate to say it, but it was like looking at a woman with some fake surgery. It was a beautiful woman, but she was fake. And as much as I wanted to make love to that woman, she had a breath on her that just was a mile wide. I wasn't going to kiss her. And I knew that relationship was not going to work out. I think in a lot of ways too, what I was discovering is that there is a level of cognitive dissonance that's required as we go through life that enables us to move forward or either to shut down. And for me, this is where I was really proud of the durability that I talk about, is that I could see the contradictions that were forming. I certainly was doing a lot of reading, and I was understanding things, and I was asking very good questions. And they were fair questions, but I was not going to find those answers at BYU, and I certainly wasn't going to get them from the professors that I was associating with. And even when I studied as an English major, when I made the choice to get out of accounting and into English, I have no memory of a lot of my professors, save one, Dr. Craycroft, who I adored. And I took a class in American humor with him, and he pointed me to James Thurber, who was a life-saving writer for me, My Life in Hard Times and The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. They've come back at various points in my life. I'll touch on that in just a moment. But most of the professors, I never felt that I could have a real open dialogue with them, although I will give deference to the fact that I do believe that a lot of those professors in the English department at that time, they were very much of the same opinion about certain things, about the cultural discordancy and then the spiritual aspects of some of the gospel orientation. Although, I also had some professors that, every lecture started with a very heartfelt prayer, and, it didn't matter what we were reading. I mean, we could be reading the Odyssey by Homer, and, maybe there was something that was a little bit strident in terms of challenging God. I think of this particular professor, and he'd try to pull it back as if to, bring in some kind of voice of the general authority-ship to make it apply back to the broader doctrine. And I thought, dude, you're cheapening this, man. Homer had nothing to do with Mormonism. So, there was that. And ultimately, and I mean this with the most kindness in my heart, BYU was for me in the final act and analysis, it was a clean, well-lighted place. And it offered me the same kind of shade under the leaves of the tree after the hot intensity of the Mormon self-righteousness, much like the old gentleman that Hemingway writes about in that short story, who just wanted to sit and drink brandy in the evening, who was deaf and a little bit blind, and he just needed a quiet place to exist and not be troubled by the world. And I think BYU did offer me that, and I'm grateful for it. But it was also a campus that was in a moment of mass renovation. And it was very disappointing to me because even the outward aspect of the inward troubles that I was having with my faith, the outward aspect of the campus was just a chain link nightmare. It was a mess. And it was not the BYU I'd been dreaming about since I was a little kid. And I thought, well, this is all fine and good. They're going to renovate this library that I loved reading in the library. I was a literary guy, but it was just a big mess. Everything was all corded off and chain link fence and, signs and placards of these beautifully architected images of what was going to be. And it was going to all be after I was gone. So I just remember I was like, this is just not what I wanted, but I did the best I could. And I picked the glide path that made the most sense. Studying literature to me, and I was already very well read at the time, but I knew that I was going to gain a lot too by really paying attention to the assignments that were given. And I was not an adequate enough writer at that time, and I really wasn't very focused on that idea. I think for me, I just knew I was going to get better grades because I was going to read anyway, and I was a good reader. But I had the idea, like Shakespeare always presented to me, that what he wrote about was the broad and full spectral thrust of humanity. And so as an English major at BYU, this is where the cognitive dissonance comes in. There is a very static, prescriptive plan that Mormons are told to follow. And it's like an algebra equation that, if then, and then it equals that. So if you do this, you do that, you do it well, you endure to the end, you're going to get this in the end, a mansion in heaven and, exaltation and blah, blah, blah. And the fact of the matter is I don't want any of that stuff. None of that stuff ever mattered to me. In fact, it wasn't even tangible enough to think, well, that's really what I want. So at the end of the essay, when I talk about what I really want, that's what I want. Now, I realize that's a wishful dream, playing second base for the Dodgers. I'm never going to get a PhD as much as I would love to. But the idea that I could study at the doctorate level in literature, which I wish that I had had the wherewithal to maybe pursue that path, is important to me. And to be under the tutelage of somebody like Norman Maclean, where I could ask those questions. And, he's the writer of A River Runs Through It and other stories. There's a level of humanity that I was reaching for, even as a student at BYU, that allowed me to put some distance to that limited viewpoint, that elitist, superfluous viewpoint of the Mormon faith that I was born into and believed wholeheartedly for my whole life, up to the breaking point, which really began at the very end of my mission. And then by the time I got to BYU, I knew it was going to end. It just took me 20 years to get out of that. And I think that's where the cult of faith and the programming, and then of course the familial aspects, make it very, very difficult to just walk away. So studying literature further armed the long shot that I took. But the ultimate dream and aspect of how I see heaven and the idea of what's to come is that ultimately I saw myself even then that I was going to have a life as a writer, which is very paradoxical because I wasn't really writing at all. And it would be a number of years before I'd really start writing. And I'm only now just really starting to move in that direction. I have a novel coming shortly. These essays, but I've been writing very intensively for the last 10 years, and the last 6 particularly, just the reading and the writing has really taken off. And I knew at BYU that that was something that I was going to head towards. So I'm grateful that I had that grounding and the ability in that clean, well-lighted place to develop a safe zone to also pursue the messiness that I describe in the language of humanity, which is exactly that. And it's also an irony of studying at a private Mormon university the Queen's English, because English is by nature subversive, and yet it's kind too. So there's a contradiction in what it offers. It can also be brutal, but that's also part of language, and everything else I described. I want to touch briefly on Ernest Hemingway, and I bring into the fore his book, Winner Take Nothing, which was the third and final short story collection he published in 1933. It came some 3-4 years after A Farewell to Arms, which is one of my favorite novels of his, but I'm more inclined to go back to his short stories as opposed to his novels, because Hemingway by nature was, as I describe it, a gut punch writer. So he wrote really, really direct sentences. And the short stories are even more direct. And I really loved A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. I've kind of touched on some of what that story is about. The title of Winner Take Nothing to me really stuck. And I think in graduating from BYU, I was a winner because I got my degree and I got the hell out of there. And I got on with life and got into sales and yada, yada, all that came after that. But I didn't really take anything with me other than what I already had. I just fine-tuned it a little bit. And that isn't to sound pretentious or egotistical. I'm not saying that. I was very humble and I worked really hard. But I knew in walking out of BYU that there was no other path for me. My grades were screwed. I was an English major. I've always been asked, what do English majors do? And I always answer, they can do absolutely everything. And I think most corporations today, if they were wise to what they really should be doing, is get away from these MBAs and hire humanities majors. And maybe they're doing that more. The individual that has the ability to understand the dynamic of the human relationship, I think, can go a lot farther. Now, I realize I'm probably peeing in my own pants right now. I'm not saying this because I'm trying to say that I want to pursue this corporate life. I've already crossed over the Rubicon there. But what I am suggesting is that in studying humanity and being able to touch on the things that make us most human, I think the power of curiosity, the power of intellectualism, the power of empathy, those are traits that are very rare, and they will serve a greater good not only in politics and in corporations and in the schools and quite frankly in religion, which is in a lot of ways sometimes very devoid of that. Those are the kinds of qualities that I think matter the most. If anything, it helps human beings be more whole and be more true to themselves. And I was tapping into that very early on at a time when I was going through a deep faith crisis, my first true bout of depression, which at the time I didn't know what I was going through. And later in life, I would have a much more severe moment with that, which at some point I'm probably going to write very openly about. One of the other short stories, well, actually, let me finish up. So Clean, Well-Lighted Place, just in brief, what is so wonderful about that story, to me is that it is a story about two waiters at a cafe observing a gentleman he's drinking himself, probably a little silly with some brandy, but it's the perspective of the older waiter who recognizes why the man is there, as opposed to the younger waiter who just is so impetuously anxious to get out. And I think I was both of those waiters in that cafe, as well as the old gentleman all at once at BYU. And I was getting that in composite. And as I've gotten further in life, I've played each of those parts. And I think any great story, we not only go to the people that we like to read about, but we should be able to find qualities in those that we don't that also apply to us. And I was seeing that very clearly. The second short story in that collection of Winner Take Nothing that really stood out to me and still does is Wine of Wyoming. And it's a story of a guy, the narrator, who during the summer goes to Wyoming. And he befriends a French couple. I think he kind of had a thing for the French woman, if I'm remembering correctly. It's been a while since I've read it. But the story is about prohibition. And in really sharp relief, what he brings out is the fact of both American stupidity and excess. And I see that so predominantly in 2020. And I'm not going to get into the politics of this, but America has really, really gone off the rails right now. And as much as I'm devoted and love my country, and I'm proud to be an American, I'm also deeply embarrassed and troubled by it. And it's another contradiction. And so at BYU, even in those years as an English major, I was giving myself grounding for these kinds of things that allow me to be more durable and to maintain that level of contradiction, that searing counterbalance that I talk about, and also being able to weigh that through in a way that could be constructive as opposed to destructive. And that's something that really has stuck with me and has served me quite well as I've gone through life. The closing part of this is that for me, what it comes down to in writing is to be true to myself, my truest wish in the cornfield of my field of dreams, whether I get to play second base for the Dodgers or get that PhD at the University of Chicago from Norman McLean in the afterlife, and he can be my advisor. Those are wishful dreams. And I realize that sometimes we like to create our own heaven because the hell that we find ourselves in the present moment can be so powerful that even the idea of what our faith gives us is false. And so the only thing that we hold to is what we believe in our own hearts. And for me, if I really strip it down, is that I made a choice to be an English major, not at BYU, but to be an English major in life, because this life is about my work as a writer. And when this life is over, I do trust and hope that the obstruction that I've often had to face, the detours, the aggravation, the tough things that have kept me from doing what I'm capable of doing and what I'm finally getting to, will be removed, and that I will be able to write in an unfettered, true way, and that I will actually do greater good beyond than I'm even going to do here. I think sometimes one of the risks of pursuing the craft of our life is that we have no guarantee that, first of all, we're ever going to attain it or build it, or that we'll ever see the fruits of that craft. And many of us will falter along that way and say, it's just not worth it. I'll just go ahead and be an accountant. And no disrespect to accountants out there. But that's also what I was talking about there, is that I was willing enough to say, I'm going to get on a different pirate ship here than the one that I'm being told I've got to be on. And rather than being pirated away from a faith that really to me was quite false. And in hindsight, just the word I use for Mormonism is quaint. It's just a quaint little religion. They think they've got the whole thing figured out and, they're bigger than everything. And it's just a quaint little pool. And I wish them well. They're always going to be around. I mean, they've got $200-300 billion in the bank, so they're going to be okay. But in terms of my time, my resources, where it is that I want to go with my life, my focus is to do the work that I was built to do, and that's to be an honest writer, to challenge myself, to ask the questions that need to be asked, and to do it in a way that can be helpful. And that's why I'm going in the direction that I'm going. And there might come a day that maybe I do have that moment where God does read one of my books. We're all just passing through. But the choice to be an English major for me has been the one right choice. And it's seen me through some of the darkest times in my life. I want to close by just simply saying to each of you, hang in there. I know that life is it's an absurdity and it's a joy all at once. This moment in 2020 is very difficult. I've had a lot of reservation about some of the things that I'm writing because I think it almost in my mind, I think, well, this is self-serving. How is this going to be helpful to somebody else? But that's also the part of being an artist. I'm not here to report the news or to try to say the things that are already being said. I'm here to say the things I need to say. And I'm here to write about the things that I need to discover. And as I move forward in the pursuit of my own craft, in my own writing, there will be others that will benefit from that as I benefit in the work. And that's the focus that I have to give. So even in this dire moment of 2020, with so many things going wrong and so much trouble in the world, my heart is with the mission of humanity, and that's to remind myself and all of us that we are not only in this together, but these storms are going to pass, and the joys we pursue they're embedded in the deep humanity that we share. And it's in the language. And so for me as a writer, I get to work with language. And to me, that is the single power, the superpower that we as Americans, we as human beings in the world have and share. And if we take the time to nurture that language and use it in a way that challenges, but at the same time heals, then I think we get where we're supposed to go. So if I've offended anybody that's still in the cloak of Mormonism or has an ideology that maybe I've touched on, that I said something offensive or was offering too much of an innuendo in one way that was not pleasing, I would kindly just simply say it's okay. And you can have that opinion because I still love you. And I'll bid you adieu if it's too much to listen to. But the path that I'm going on is going to challenge certain things because ultimately it's about getting to that finer humanity, which is really the healing power of empathy and kindness through the language that we pursue. I'm grateful that I am an English major, and I will be for this life and whatever comes after. I look forward to the next essay coming hopefully soon. My novel is probably, at this point, the target that I have for the manuscript is to be completed outright by August 31st. I'm going to do some final polishing, and then I will begin sending out query letters on October 1st. It's very close, very proud of the work that I'm doing. The essays are the nonfiction version of Russell Cordell Staker, and the novelist Russell Cordell Staker is working on some tremendously great fiction that I'm really excited to put out into the world, and we'll see what comes of it. So until next time, I bid you adieu. Have a wonderful evening, and please wear a mask.